Right about now.
Right about now.
You're about to witness
the Funk Soul Brother,
Jonathan Small.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Right About Now podcast. This is John Small. All right. I got a question for you. Does it make your skin crawl when people use words like and dude and literally all the time, every hella second? Is that annoying just hearing me talk that way? Well, you are not alone in your irritation. I am right there with you. I think a little piece of me dies every time I hear my kids say words like dude and and brah. But my guest, Valerie Fridland, says that these features of our speech aren't a sign of cultural and linguistic degeneration. No. They're actually a good thing. In fact, they're revolutionary. Seriously, dude? Valerie is a sociolinguist at the University of Nevada, Reno, and the author of a great new book called Literally, Dude, Arguing for the Good in Bad English. Her book is really a fun read. It combines history, psychology, science experiments to explain why we speak the strange way we do, and where these irritating linguistic tics come from, and why ultimately they're not such a bad thing or the end of the world as we know it. So in our conversation, which made me super hyper aware of how often I say words like and just a warning, we talk about how the word actually serves a useful purpose in the English language, why this new advent of the word literally is what we call an intensifier word, and what exactly that means. We talk about the origin story of the word dude. We talk about how filler words like and actually help people understand you better. And then we get into my favorite topic, vocal fry, where that comes from and why people talk that way. Valerie was a fantastic interview. I learned so much, and I think you will too. So without further ado, I bring you Valerie Fridland. Valerie Fridland, welcome to the Right About Now podcast.
Well, thank you. I'm very excited to be here.
Yeah, you have such interesting insights into how we use language, how words that we think are silly and trivial are actually important and have a different meaning. And I love how you go back anyway, I'm a big fan.
Well, thank you. That means a lot.
Let me first start with understanding what you do for a living, because it's a really interesting job that you have. You are a sociolinguist. Is that what it's called?
I am. And it's a hard thing to say. So good job for you to say that. So in the first time too, I'm always getting people that don't want to introduce me. They fight over who has to introduce me because it's such a tongue twister to say, sociolinguist when you're up in front of a few hundred people.
Yes.
But you did a great job.
Thank you.
Yes, it is a fun job. It's a unique job. And I will be honest that when I was, 12, 15, thinking about what I wanted to do with my life, sociolinguist was not on the tip of my tongue.
Really?
Or even in my brain. I didn't know it existed, but I discovered it through college when I took a linguistics course. That was a required course for my major. And, there's a lot of theoretical parts to linguistics. There's syntax, there's phonology, there's phonetics and semantics. And all of those are great. I actually love those, but they're not very sexy sounding to an 18-year-old. But sociolinguistics, which delves into things like how the way that we interact and our social lives and our social beliefs affect the way we talk, is a lot more fun when you're 18 and 19 and you're trying to figure out life and why things happen to you in certain ways and why you and your boyfriend don't understand each other. And really, that was truly my motivation to do this. I took a class. I had a boyfriend at the time that I swear it sounded like we were never saying the same thing or understanding each other. And we did a section on language and gender. And all of a sudden I'm like, oh my God, it's linguistics. That's his problem. And it was like the heavens parted, opened, and the light shone down, and I all of a sudden knew what I needed to do. And
that was the spark, and that was at Georgetown, right?
That was at Georgetown. That's right.
But your background is interesting because maybe without being aware of it at the time, you had an interesting relationship with language, right? Tell us a little about your, where you were born and your upbringing, et cetera.
Sure. Definitely, I was really primed, I think, for a linguistic path because my parents are both non-native English speakers. They are both French native speakers. My father's Belgian and my mother's French Canadian. And they moved to the United States for my dad's work, which was at St. Jude Children's Research Hospital in Memphis, Tennessee.
Okay.
So, we were transplants. My parents were very exotic at that time in Memphis, which had really very few non-native speakers of my parents' origins. And I grew up surrounded by Southern speakers. And what's funny is I think a lot of Southerners often feel like they're ostracized for the way they speak. But growing up, I often felt that way because I didn't sound like my peers. And they always commented on the way my parents talked. It was something that I know they meant well because it was more like, this is beautiful. I like this. It's new and it's different. But as a, 7 or 8-year-old or a 10-year-old, the last thing you want to do is stand out. And
yeah, it's embarrassing.
I just got really tired of having people call out my parents' accents. So I think it just made me really interested in what drives us to speak the way we speak and to notice and perceive people differently based on it.
I find the accent thing, I know we're not going to talk about that today, but the whole accent thing so fascinating and why people, certain regions have different accents. And the Southern accent, you don't have one. I don't know if you've shed it, but like, how come you don't have it Southern? Is it because you had French parents, you think?
It's actually a really interesting combination. And you'll be happy to learn that my next book is actually all about accents. So all your questions will be answered when that one comes out.
Because I'm from New York. So, the difference between the New York accent and the Southern accent is just fascinating to me. But anyway.
Well, and the origins for that actually start with the original colonists. So North and South were really divided early on. In fact, if you look at New England settlement patterns and then the coastal Southern settlement patterns in Tidewater, Virginia, which was where Jamestown was, the original settlers came from somewhat different places in Britain, but also later settlement patterns were quite different and their goals and the type of settlers were very different. And those set in what we call founders effects, which are substantive cultural differences among groups that lead to not just social differences, but linguistic differences over time. So that really is what set up that difference between Northern and Southern speech. And back to the point about my speech, I did have a slight Southern twang. In fact, when I was in college, I took Chinese in college, my Chinese drill master, as they called him, used to joke that I always sounded like I was singing Chinese opera because I had such a sing-songy Southern intonation pattern, the prosodic temperament of my speech. But I think that I have shed it some because I spent a lot of time out of the South. And, I used to get called out for my accent on the small parts that I did have, even though it was never strong. And I didn't do it intentionally. It just, I think over time kind of flattened out because I didn't start with a very heavy accent. Coming from a background where my parents were non-native, our earliest speech system tends to come from our parents. So till about 5, we take on the system of our primary caregiver. So the vowels and the consonants that my parents used, I actually spoke with those. And then you shift to your peer group. But if you come from a background where your parents are non-native and a lot of their friends are non-native, so my parents a lot of times flocked with other non-native speakers, it does have an influence on you and it sort of dampens the effects of strong accented speech. Interesting.
All right. So your book, here you are, you're this serious scholar. You teach sociolinguistics at University of Nevada, Reno, and you have written many, serious dissertations and books about language. But this book, you are defending some of the most, what people would think some of the most indefensible words like dude and literally and like and So tell me why you wrote this book. Like, why was this book something that you felt you needed to write?
Well, I think the main reason is no one else would want to read those other books I wrote. I have written quite a few things over the years, academic books and a lot of scholarly articles, and mainly on speech features that are defined by regional differences. So I do a lot with Northern, Southern, and Western speech. And what I would find is I would get invited to give talks a lot at public venues to public audiences that didn't have a linguistic background. And I would talk about my research. And I would try to make it very relatable. Everybody, knows someone who's from a different region, and we notice those things. And we often talk about things like pin and pen, or how in New England you might say aunt instead of aunt, and those kinds of things. So I try to make it about things that people could relate to and recognize. But what I found is after I would get done talking, people would have all these questions, and they almost never were about what I was talking about, and they almost always were about the same set of 10 things, which was, why do people say like all the time? Or how do I stop saying like all the time? Or I hate it when people use literally, non-literally, or vocal fry makes women sound stupid. It was the same things. And I thought, I just actually answered why these things are happening the way they are in what I told you in my talk, but I didn't give those audiences the tools to understand how what I was talking about in my talk related to the questions about the specific things they were asking about, because they all are actually driven by the same underlying processes, social and linguistic processes. But it's hard to make that leap unless you're an academic. So I just thought, well, why don't I write a book about all those things that people want to know about and tell them the linguistic side, because all they've had is the prescriptive side.
But it's one thing to explain these words, and we're going to get into it because some of this, the what you found out when you did a deep dive into words like dude and like, et cetera, it's fascinating to me. But you also defend them as actually like a progress. Like it's actually part of the development of language, right? You're not saying, we got to get rid of the word like. We got to get rid of the overuse of the word literally when we don't actually use it in a literal way. So tell me why you think it's just all part of a natural progress of language. And I said progress, not progress. So I don't even know if I said that right.
That's exactly right, because it's progress now and not progress, at least for us.
Right.
Language naturally changes. It's the inherent state of language. We don't speak Proto-Indo-European anymore because it is the natural course of language to change. And even the Proto-Indo-Europeans, which sort of populated Eurasia in 10,000 years ago, that was not the original language either. They had come from something else, and it gradually split into all these different languages. Proto-Indo-European became the Romance languages. It became the Germanic languages. It even became Sanskrit. So it obviously is the natural course that language changes drastically over time. And in fact, we have evidence of that anytime you've been forced to read Beowulf, which no one wants to do, or Shakespeare, yes, which my 9th grade daughter complained miserably about being unintelligible back in the day. So, I think the thing is we forget that this very English we speak today is drastically different than the English of 1,000 years ago. And we see our moments, our changes, things like or literally, or vocal fry, or singular they, or the umming and uhing that we do as novel things that are decaying language. But if we look back in time, we'll actually see that the changes that have happened over the last 300 years are very, very small compared to the changes that have occurred in English the previous 600. And those changes not just were new words, which we got tons of. In fact, the word stock of English has changed about 70% since its inception. That means we've gotten 70% new words. But also we lost the word endings we had. We lost case marking. We lost grammatical gender. We went from a word ordering that was fairly flexible because they had endings to a word ordering that now is not flexible unless you're Yoda. We changed so much. So I think what I wanted people to understand is if we look at history, we can understand contemporary changes in a totally different way. And even things that we don't like happen because there are needs that speakers have that are not met by the current system that we put in place. So even something like, which is probably the most universally despised new feature that I hear about, it actually has a really important purpose. And we sometimes think of it as just verbal trash, but it's actually something that helps us in ways that are very complex and historically based. And if we can unpack that and look at it scientifically, we might have a better perspective on why speakers are doing it. And also, if we don't like doing it, it gives us a scientific, controlled, organized way to approach it to delete it from our speech. So if we understand things better, we can do things like appreciate them or get rid of them. We have a lot more flexibility.
This episode of Right About Now is brought to you by AG1. And this is not just a plug here. I actually use and like this product quite a bit. I've partnered with AG1 because they make a really high quality product that I genuinely look forward to drinking every day. And you cannot say that for me and many health products. So take my word on this one. You will like the way this tastes, and you will like the way it makes you feel. And it also makes the whole process of taking supplements a lot simpler. Like I just don't want to have bottles and bottles of different pills in my cabinets. I just take 1 scoop of AG1 in my smoothie every morning and boom, I'm good to go. I've got all the prebiotics, probiotics, and digestive enzymes that I need for my always grouchy gut. Urgh. So look, take my word for it. Do I lie that much on this podcast? Not really. AG1 is definitely worth it. And I've got a special deal for my Right About Now listeners. You try AG1 and you will get a free 1-year supply of vitamin D3 and K2, and also 5 free AG1 travel packs to take with you when you are on the road. All you have to do is go to drinkag1.com/rightaboutnow. That is drinkag1.com/right, WRITE, about now. All right, back to the show. All right, so you brought up the L word, the other L word, as Christopher Hitchens said.
There's a lot of L words, literally. Like
there's a lot of L words. So like, I want to talk about like, cause it's a fascinating word. It's interesting that, I think I used like a lot when I was younger, right? Like I think, and now I'm so self-conscious about using the word like, but anyway.
I have that effect on people.
Yes. I think when, and I work with a lot of young people. So, when I talk to anybody that's like sort of under the age of like, say 28, they use like a lot. Right. Or when I interview people on this podcast, I notice they use like a lot if they're of a certain age group. And I know that I used like a lot when I was younger. You say that obviously all these new kind of tics or these new, what are words or I don't know what the word is to say, the new trends in language come from youth. Right. But we also cast it aside, it seems like, as we get older. So what's that all about? Like, do you think people who use like a Gen Zer right now, who's used like my daughter, who's using like a lot, who's 15. Is she going to be, and when she's 35, do you think she'll use it as much? Probably not. She won't speak that way anymore. I don't think.
No, you asked actually quite a few complex questions. So we'll break it down to
okay.
a couple of different, more palatable pieces.
Like I'm like all over the place.
Well, there's so much. Language is so fascinating. That's why I can't stop talking about it. So right. I totally get it. Let's take like as a feature that was born of young speakers. The reality is that young speakers do push language forward. Mostly what we see is innovation through the novel use of adolescence. Mm-hmm. And part of that is born from the greater cognitive plasticity that we have in childhood and adolescence, because our brain lateralizes as we get about 11 or 12. And it also is still in development until we hit early 20s. And so that actually gives us a little more fluidity in the way that we think and the types of things that we're attracted to. As anybody who has survived teenagers knows, teenagers don't think the same way adults do, and they're not attracted to the same things that adults are attracted to. They want things that make them stand out, or make them fit in, but make them fit in with certain groups. And they're also very, very aware of social marking and of social sort of socio-stylistic activities and music, and also the way they talk. And so like is something that's attractive to that age group because it's not your parent's speech. I mean, that's part of the point. It's also the flexibility of youth that allows features to be used in new ways. So like has been around in our speech for centuries. In fact, we go back to the 12th century in English, we find like as a verb. Obviously, it wasn't said just like at that time, but it existed in English. But we don't see it being used as a conjunction or a preposition until about the 15th or 16th century. So it wasn't originally a conjunction or a preposition. So if you say something like a boss, right, that's a preposition use. Or if I say something, he rode his bike like he was on fire, that's a conjunctive use of like. So those are actually novel uses in the history of English. It went from being only a verb and sometimes an adjective to now being a preposition or a conjunction. And I'm betting some 16th century parents were like, God, that sucks. Stop saying that. It was new at the time because what we do is we take an aspect of a word's meaning, and then we find it useful in another context. So we expand it to fit another context. So I think a great example of that in modern speech is saying adulting. Adult is a noun, and it has been a noun for centuries, but it's only been a verb very, very recently because we're trying to describe something else that's not just he is an adult, that he is a person that meets these criteria, to the whole idea of what it is to be an adult sucks. And that's where I need to change how I use that word to make it understandable to other people to express that meaning. And that's what we did with like. So like was expressing as a conjunction or preposition similarity. So he is like a spider, or he's like a tiger, something like that. It's setting up two things as being similar. Well, so that means you're making an approximation between one thing and another. So then what if we start using like to mean approximation? Like, I think I'll do that, but I'm not sure. Or he's like 12. Mm-hmm. And so there you went from expressing similarity to expressing approximation or subjectivity, where you're basically riffing off its original meaning, but using it in a novel way. And that's something that young people are really, really flexible with and do really well, that older speakers don't, because we've worn grooves in our brains to work a certain way. And just like we fall into habits, I mean, if you're a smoker, you know how hard it is to break a habit. If you speak in a certain way your whole life, you're in that groove, that's the way you know how to speak. But if you're a young speaker, you haven't worn those grooves so deeply. And so you're more flexible in reshaping those grooves to novel innovations. And like is one of those, as well as in intensifiers like hecka and hella and those types of things.
When did like as a quotation come into vogue? Like, I was like, da 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 da, or he was like,
right,
da, da, da,
where it's instead of the verb to say. That's actually its most recent novel use. So, like as a discourse marker, where it would be in the middle of a sentence. So, he's like gonna go. That actually has been around. We find some uses like that in the 17th and 18th century.
That's crazy.
In criminal court trials. So it's been, and not in America, right? It was in Britain. So it's a British feature. We can blame the British
blame
for
the
that
Brits
one.
for like. But it wasn't alas.
Girls.
I think you wrote at some point, alas was yesterday's like you, instead of saying like, you would say, well, alas.
Exactly.
All the teenagers are like,
we always have had discourse markers. There's one from Old English that was that was used so often in texts of the era that it had to be a discourse marker, and would have been even more prevalent than like. Sometimes we find it. So there always have been things that irritate people.
What do you mean by discourse marker exactly? Like that?
Where it's not part of the actual literal meaning of the sentence, but it adds flavor like a like does. So what like does as a discourse marker is it either goes at the beginning of a sentence or somewhere in the middle to express subjectivity. So when I say he's like a brother to me, or like he's a brother to me, there I can kind of take it away. I'm not saying he is a brother to me. I'm saying he's approximately something like, in my subjective opinion, a brother to me. So it's not adding strict meaning, but it's adding a sense, a flavor, a little flair, or it tells you how to understand linkages between two things. So if I say, I'm not going to do that. Like, I thought about it, but I'm not going to do it. What I'm doing there is I'm linking that second sentence to the first sentence. So it's not actually contributing to the semantic meaning, the literal meaning of the sentences, but it gives you a little conversational coherence.
Right.
It tells you how to understand one sentence in relation to another. And so other discourse markers are things that often go at the beginning of sentences. So something like, in fact, so, although. Yeah. That tell you how to understand linkages or interpretations between sentences, but themselves don't carry a lot of literal meaning. That makes sense?
Totally. Here's what's interesting. We're talking a lot about speaking English right now and talk, the way people talk. But I feel like a lot of these rules have not carried on to the way people write. Like, we're still pretty formal in the way we write. I mean, compared to the way we speak, at least when we're not writing texts. We're still kind of formal in the way we write, but in our language that we speak, we can be much more informal.
That's a really interesting observation that is drawing from the idea that writing is a very different system than spoken language. And if you think about it, it makes sense because spoken language has existed for thousands of years longer than written language. So we can probably estimate that language as we use it existed about 50,000 years ago, maybe a little more rudimentary, but basically, I mean, some people have even positive up to 150,000 years ago. That's unlikely, but not in the form that we use it now, but it's been around for a long time. Writing is about 5,000 years old. So clearly you don't need to be able to write to be able to speak. And civilization has certainly progressed and advanced really, really far with no writing system at all. Right. And in fact, it's only fairly recent that literacy is widespread. Most people in the early, middle, and modern English periods were not literate. The majority of people couldn't read and write. They could speak. So this idea that writing and spoken language are connected is actually a fallacy. Written language developed from spoken language, not the other way around. But written language developed for reasons that spoken language didn't do well. And that's, for example, sending messages across time and space. It's really hard to do that. If you're not in shouting distance of someone, if you're not in the same time frame as someone, then that message will never get through. We want to write things down so that our ancestors can, our progeny can know something about us later. In fact, kings were really keen on doing that. A lot of our earliest writings in English come from chronicles that kings had scribes write to tell about their exploits and how great they were. We've always wanted to do that kind of thing. So that's one reason you write. You also write because we want to have people farther away be able to read what we say. So those are the main reasons writing developed. It really isn't until, at least in English, about the 18th century that we started to get really firm ideas about how we should write and what it should look like. If we look at old texts, there's a lot of diversity in spelling. There were not spelling conventions until about the 17th or 18th century. There's a lot of divergence in the way things were phrased.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
We didn't have the same sort of set ideas of how things should be. Now, the Greeks were a little more rigid. So they were obviously very into writing, and they also had beliefs about formal language and how to be a great orator that did have a lot about standardization. But in English, which was a bastard language, we really didn't get that till about the 18th century. So what happened with writing is around the 18th century, when the upper class had a lot of power, but was losing it because of the Industrial Revolution. So they weren't just the wealthy class anymore. They had land and they had titles, but they were starting to lose out on the power and prestige of money and fashion, because a lot of the middle class had risen up because they became merchants or owned the industries at that time. Well, the only thing that separated them was language. And so a lot started getting written about the norms of the upper class so that people that were rising up, the upwardly mobile middle class, could emulate those norms and sound more like the upper class. And those became the written norms that we follow. A lot of them were actually based on Latin, because Latin was considered a pure language, a good language. English was considered a sort of vulgar language. So a lot of our rules, like don't end a sentence with a preposition or don't split infinitives, that we follow in writing and not in speech, because we end sentences with preposition all the time in speech. Yeah. They were actually based on Latin, because in Latin, you don't end sentences with preposition. And in Latin, infinitives are actually one word, not two like in English. So if I say to go or to see, that's two words in English, but that would not be two words in Latin. So to split them would be wrong in Latin. And it was just this really arbitrary idea that, okay, well, Latin's good, so let's make English the same. And those became a lot of our written rules. So they're really, really arbitrary, and they have nothing to do with the actual rules we follow as speakers, but we have developed these conventions that make us sound educated and upper class. And that's what we follow in written language. So things we do in written language are often different than things we do in spoken language. Sorry, that was a bit of a long answer.
No, but it's fast. I've always wondered, and I wonder if, like I said, I feel like in the world of texting and kind of short language, writing is changing, right?
Mm-hmm. Very much so.
But when you read a novel, it still follows a lot of the conventions that we've been following for a long time in terms of the rules of grammar and stuff. And I wonder if the way we write will evolve over time as well.
Oh, I think it has. I think it already has. I mean, if you look at writing, and actually there have been some studies on this, it has become more informal over time. Mm-hmm. A lot of things that we wouldn't accept in writing before in the early 1900s.
Such as ending a sentence with a preposition. I've talked to a few grammarians who accept that as like, that's fine now. You can end it.
Or singular they, right? It's widely accepted now to use singular they, where it wasn't even, I think, 10 years ago. So or who and whom. I don't think I have a single student that would know when to use whom anymore. Yeah. When I get a paper, it almost always is who, no matter where the who is. So, these things do change over time. And I think
slowly,
we also just see things like coming in more. The other thing is, I don't know if you're familiar with the Winston. I'm not a smoker, even though I've talked about it twice. But there was a cigarette ad in the 1950s that was, Winston tastes good like a cigarette should.
Uh-huh.
Now, can you tell me what's wrong with that sentence?
Winston tastes good like a cigarette should. I mean, I don't know, like the comma, where the comma is. This is terrible, because here I am, a professional editor.
It's a hard question, because nowadays it would be fine. But in the 1950s, what really repulsed people about that was not that smoking is bad for your health.
Yeah.
But it's that it was like used as a conjunction, which was considered very vulgar. So it should be Winston tastes good as a cigarette should, if you're following prescriptive norms. But now if in writing, even in newspaper writing or novels, I think very few people would notice that like is used as a conjunction.
And people don't really use as that way anymore.
No, you sound very stuffy if you use it that way. So I do think that writing has become more informal, and I think texting has really driven part of that. It makes us a lot less formal in the way that we talk to each other in daily interactions. But I think you're kind of building on something really interesting here, in both the difference between written language and spoken language, and the difference between texting and formal writing is the immediacy of the interaction you're having. Mm-hmm. So the other purpose of writing is that you're writing to an audience that may not be known. So you're not talking, when you're writing something down, you're not talking to somebody in your immediate vicinity. You're talking to an unknown audience. And so there's a formality with that because they're not people you know. And also you have to make adjustments to have your language be something that you might think will translate better to multiple dialects and multiple global Englishes. And so you're going to take away local flavor because you want it to be more broad. But when you're having a conversation with someone, either face-to-face or over text, you know who you're talking to, you know the type of language that they're going to have. And also you typically have an intimate relationship with them of some sort. I mean, I don't text my boss. I text my friends or my husband or, my children. Maybe that's formal when they're in trouble, but it's a different relationship. And so your writing will be more informal. And then what I think is, as we become more used to that being our daily writing, and it might be more comfortable to us, we might be incorporating that into our written, more formal language in other contexts as well. So I do think we're going to see a more informal push or move in formal writing as well due to that.
All right, I want to move on to and which you flag in your book. Now, this resonates with me because I'm a big and and I only know this because I'm also a podcaster and I spend a lot of time editing my podcast. I edit my own podcast, right? So I'm unfortunately forced to listen to my voice and the way I speak all the time. And it's actually given me a real insight just in the way people speak in general, because when you're editing audio, you hear people's conversational tics and habits and stuff. And so I can tell whether I'm going to have an right away. And then I'm going to okay, that's going to be a long night of editing because I'm going to cut out a lot of ums. Now, it's interesting because people who listen to this podcast might not know that I'm a big ummer and ahher because I cut out, when you listen to this podcast, most of my ums and uhs have been removed. Here I go. Because I thought they made me sound dumb and kind of clueless, and it kind of slowed the pace down. But then I read your book and I was like, oh, maybe ums and ahs are not always so bad. I mean, I noticed that comedians use ums and ahs in a very strategic way. But, I always thought ums and ahs made it sound like you were dumb, right? Either that you were dumb or that you were anxious, like a nervous Nelly, right? But they're neither of those things. So can you help us understand the use of and why you did some really interesting research into why we use those words in our speech?
I think and are the one feature in the book, or the two features, I guess, in the book that most surprised people because they're so universally disliked. I don't think there's a single person who ever adds more ums and uhs into their speech on purpose. Yeah. And any speech teacher will tell you, as right.
See, this is the problem with this interview is everything I say.
Once you start talking about it, it's hard not to do it. I don't think any speech teacher would tell you that they're a positive feature from a speech giving perspective or a public speaking perspective. And I think that's true that people don't like them, but there's a difference between a speech feature that we don't like and one that actually doesn't serve a benefit. And and serve benefits, strong benefits, and they actually help us in many ways, both from a perspective of a speaker and the perspective of a listener. But that doesn't mean that they're socially favored. And that's where I think we get the rub of and Now, and are found when we do research on where they occur. They're found to occur more often before difficult, complex, less frequent, or less familiar words, which means I'm using language that's actually more technical or more difficult when I'm using an or Now, I don't know about you, but I actually want people to use smart words around me. I want people to think about what they're saying when they're around me. And so when someone's or umming, that indicates that they're actually speech planning and they're digging deeper into the cognitive reaches to find those words that aren't just everyday words. And so that's a really good sign. And it's funny that we are really worried about them in workplace contexts because those are exactly the contexts where we're typically doing that kind of work. I don't use the same words at work that I do when I go home, and which is why I don't and to my family the same rate that I and in front of a bunch of colleagues when I'm giving a presentation or when I'm talking about something that's coming up the next week at work. It's because I'm actually trying to sound smarter. I'm trying to think harder. I'm using words that are less frequent. Also, when I use bigger sentences, so I'm saying a sentence that might have an embedded sentence in it rather than just a simple sentence, I also will and more often. And this is one of the reasons that we tend to start sentences with an or an because our brain is actually mapping out the syntactic structure we're about to use. And the or signal cognitive processing. So what it really is signaling as a speaker is that I'm actually doing hard work for you. But the even more fascinating part. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I'm saying you hear that, listeners, when you hear me umming and ahhing. I'm doing all the work. I'm trying to come up with a really good question.
And one thing that's funny is podcasters mention it to me all the time because they are very aware of how often they or because they play themselves back. And when you're not focused on content, which you don't tend to be when you're editing, you're not worrying about what someone's saying. You're worrying about how they're saying it. You really start to notice them when, as a listener, you tend to kind of erase them.
Yeah, I think you wouldn't even
And studies show the more dynamic a speaker, the less we hear their umming and ahhing. So if you're very interesting and a very dynamic speaker, it doesn't matter if you or because people actually filter those out. It's when you're monotonous, when you're kind of uninteresting, when you're giving a rote presentation that sounds super, super boring. That's when people start to focus on how you're delivering things rather than what you're delivering. And that's one of the reasons we tend to dislike them because they often get coupled with other things we dislike, which is boring presentations that are delivered in a bad sort of boring tone. So I think that's where they get a really bad rap. But from a speaker's perspective, they're helpful because they help us get things out. But what's really interesting is the work they do for a listener. From a listener perspective, they help signal to a listener that a speaker is going to take a pause, that they need just a second to think through things. And actually, when we look at how they pattern, we find that when a speaker says, they're indicating they just need a short pause. But when they say, it means they're actually thinking harder and need a longer pause. So we find that there's actually a difference in how long people pause when they're using or which tells a speaker how long they need to wait before they take over the floor and say, okay, you don't know what you're talking about. I'm going to start in here. But even more interesting is that they actually seem to help people remember what you say better when you use an or an before it. And that's because and signal complexity and they signal new information. So it's not an old word that we've been talking about because that would be easy to access. It's a new word or a new thing. And so when I use an or it seems like it makes a listener's brain actually cue in more. And we find in pop tests given about an hour after a conversation or a study, people actually remember words that followed or more than they remember words that didn't. So lots of real solid benefits that we see in research to using and
Who knew? And
Who knew? Well, I didn't. As I was doing the research, I was like, wow, this is cool.
That is super interesting. Let's talk about the word literally, because literally this word has taken over our culture. And I know people ask you about this all the time, but it does drive people crazy because most of the time that we use literally, we don't mean literally. It's like, I think it's what you call, it's a discourse. What do you call it? A
it's
discourse.
An intensifier.
It's an intensifier. So what do you mean by that? It's an intensifier.
Well, that's sort of the class of words that it falls into when we look at it from a linguistic perspective in terms of how it functions and what other words it classifies with. So we call them adverbial intensifiers in English, which is a fancy way of saying it maps with words like very or so or really or totally or absolutely, all those ly adverbs in punching up or making more emphatic whatever follows, which is typically an adjective or a verb. So you can be literally starving and literally frozen without actually being either dying of starvation or truly frozen. But what you're trying to get across there is it's a very emphatic feeling that you're experiencing, and it's a lot of something. They're also sometimes called degree words because they express the degree to which you are feeling something. So if I'm very happy, that's a high degree of happiness. If I'm totally lost, that's a very extreme degree of being lost. And if I'm literally starving, that's an extreme degree of hunger. So that's what an intensifier does. It intensifies an adjective or a verb.
I guess in my generation, it would be more like totally, instead
Totally,
of saying
exactly.
literally.
What's fascinating about intensifiers, they're the most rapidly evolving area of any language. So we see an incredibly rapid turnover and intensification, meaning what that means in everyday terms is we use new ones all the time because the old ones stop having the punch after we use them too much. So how many times do you say very?
Yeah.
A lot, right? So now if I'm very hungry, that's not the same thing as being, I'm extremely hungry. I'm so totally hungry.
I'm hella hungry. Yeah.
Not doing it anymore, right? Very has lost its punch. And so we need new intensifiers. And for that reason, we see over the course of English, we recycle and switch over and get new intensifiers all the time. And then sometimes old intensifiers actually cycle back around. So I don't know if you use the word pretty. I'm pretty hungry. I'm pretty happy.
Of course, yeah.
Well, pretty actually is a resurgence of a 16th century intensifier that, for example, Shakespeare used. So we actually see them come back around over time.
It's so interesting how these words resurface and who was the first person to start using that word and how did it catch on? I'm sure there was a columnist for the New York Times that used to write about where words came from. And
William Safire?
William Safire. God, I used to love reading his column. But even like words like fire, like that word is now, you have teenagers, so like it's fire. Rather than saying it's like fire, they say it's fire, right? Oh, that rap is fire, right?
Right. Or lit.
lit.
Same thing as that's lit.
Yeah. It's just interesting how where these things come from. And of course, I don't know. And then they recycle. Sometimes they come from hip hop. Sometimes they come from TikTok. I don't know. I'm sure.
Well, what you notice about those is most of them come from younger speakers because they, as I said, they're more flexible and innovative with language. They also tend to come from subcultures. So they're edgy and interesting and novel because they're not mainstream. And that's what makes them attractive. And so a lot of times they're a repurposing of a word to take, as I said, with literally or with like, it takes on some sense of the original meaning, but uses it in a new way. So fire means that's hot, right? It's exciting. It's really burning. It's noticeable. And so we use that in this new way that it's not a fire, but that's fire.
Yeah.
And that's what gives it its power.
And you also mentioned that a lot of these words come from women as opposed to men. Like women seem to be at the forefront of, bringing in that new language into our experience. Is that?
Well, certainly ones that don't have a lot of stigma attached. So slang is a little different. So when we talk about slang words like something like riz or slay or fire, those often do get used more by young men who are more interested in sort of that dangerous, edgy kind of allocation that they have. But in words like literally or like that do more conversational work that are kind of the heavy lifters of conversation, those tend to be more innovated by women. Partially because women are more sensitive to the social value of language because it's been historically more important for them. We've put a lot more pressure on women in language than we have on men historically. Women have often historically not had access to standard language or written formal types of language. It's only fairly recent that women are educated and literate at the levels that men are, because for example, the 17th and 18th century, they didn't have access to that. So women tended to use more colloquial, informal language that was more intimate. And a lot of times innovation is born of intimacy because when we use formal language, it's distancing. When we use informal colloquial language, it brings us closer and it's signaling solidarity. And for many centuries, women would have each other and speak mainly to each other in these informal contexts. And then they would have husbands and children that they would also have the same conversations with. What they didn't have is workplace conversations when they had a pressure for standard language on them. And therefore, they were more free to innovate with language and do things that signaled intimacy rather than formality.
You know what's interesting is women have started using the word dude. I've been using the word dude since I've been a dude, like forever. But I've noticed that my daughter now, who's 14, I think actually, sorry. I think I said she was 15 before I'm aging her. I hear her saying all the time to her friend, dude. And she even calls him bro sometimes. So it's interesting, but the word dude gets a lot of play in your book. And you have to read the whole thing, your whole chapter on dude. It's fascinating. But if you can give us like a sketch of that word has been around forever and it's changed meaning. It used to be a derogatory term, right?
Right. Well, it's been around since the late 1800s, and it really probably got its start as a fusion of doodle and dandy. Mm-hmm. So it became duty. We find early references to duty that then got shortened to dude.
That means something completely different now.
It somehow doesn't have that. Can you see your daughter say duty? It just doesn't have the same power. And
no,
I don't think you want to introduce that term to her. I don't think
exactly.
she'd like it. You can't say what you're actually saying is duty, dear. I don't think she would like that much, but duty shortened to dude. And as you can tell from just the way we react to duty, it wasn't a favorable term in the late 1800s. It was basically calling someone a dandy or a fop.
Yeah.
And it was really to describe men of the era that were overly concerned with having a good time, with wearing fancy clothes that were usually sort of effeminate, and with powdering themselves, and with aesthetics, and very superficial. It was a complaint about men that didn't care about anything except themselves and how they looked and how beautiful they were and how much fun they had. A lot of times it was written up in the New York Times. There were many comments about dudes that were essentially insults at that time, and how people got challenged to duels because they were called a dude and they challenged someone to a duel for it. What happened is it really was about the way that dudes dressed. It was ostentatious fashion and sort of really, really showy fashion. In fact, Mark Twain talks about the iron dudes in his Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court. And what he doesn't mean is like knightly dudes. He means like these dudes dressed up thinking they're really fancy and showy, which of course, if you read it now, you think he means like Iron Man, but that's not at all what he meant. And so it started to shift where it was more about the clothes and being sort of showy than about being a dandy. And that's around the turn of the century. And that's how we get dude ranches. So what would happen is the West was a new frontier. People wanted to go visit from the East Coast, and the East Coasters would come with all their fancy outfits and end up on a dude ranch with, stubby and cow shit.
Yeah.
They were called dudes. And then it got picked up by the zoot suiters, who called each other dudes to sort of say, hey, look at us. We stand out. We're different. And that's where it got this edgy subculture and got picked up by druggy subculture and surfing subculture and became the dude that we know and love today.
And John Wayne was the dude, right? So
he was the dude. It did get picked up a lot in Westerns.
Westerns, yeah. Like dude ranches. I thought dude ranches was a dude ranch I thought was a positive use of dude, but at that time it wasn't.
Well, I don't think it was negative at that point. It had moved away from its 18th century meaning where it was truly an insult. I mean, it was truly an insult. Literally, you would challenge someone to a duel or hate them forever if they called you a dude. It wasn't at all in fun or jest. But by the early 20th century, it had become just a way to comment on someone who maybe was dressed up a little bit. So, for example, if someone was just a new recruit at the police academy and they showed up on the first day with their brand new, freshly pressed outfit on, someone would say, dude, right? There's a dude. It would be more like there's a dude than dude like we use it today. But it basically just called out people that were sort of overdressed or a little too clean. And so Dude Ranch was simply referring to the fact that a lot of dudes from the East came there and were overly dressed for what they were doing. So it wasn't really negative in that sense at that point. It was more just calling out the fact that they didn't really fit in with their clothes.
So interesting. All right. I want to end with one. You mentioned this earlier in the conversation, and that is this idea of vocal fry, because I don't think a lot of people may even know what we're talking about when we say vocal fry. So I'm going to play a sample of it right now.
I recognized him immediately and my heart just sank because I couldn't believe that I was face to face with this guy. So I'm not tickling you anymore.
Vocal fry seems to have come in very much in vogue with the Kardashians. That's the first time I heard it used and I'm sure it's been around. I'm sure you will tell me it's been around a lot earlier. But where does it come from? As a sociolinguist, can you explain vocal fry to me?
Sure. Well, vocal fry is a feature of what we call in fancy linguistic speak phonation, which simply means it's the way that the vocal folds are positioned when air is being pushed through them for speech. So in what linguists call normal phonation, the vocal folds are typically, and there are these little flaps on the top of your glottis, on the top of your larynx. And so they're sort of open and long and tense is the way that they're held. But when we're doing vocal fry, what we're doing is we're bunching them up. So they're basically muscular flaps, or they have muscles that control them. And so you can kind of manipulate them in different configurations. So when we're just doing everyday speech, they're really long and tense. But when we either relax them, so they're kind of just, hanging out there, or we bunch them up, they become heavier. And one way I like to compare vocal fry to just things people might recognize is when you push air through really laid back, lax, bunched up things and they're heavy, they flop. They kind of just flop. When you hold something really tense and tight, it will just go straight through them and it won't flop like that. And so it's the flopping of the vocal folds that make what we hear as creaky or vocal fry types of sounds. But the way I like to compare them is if you've ever boiled oil versus water, oil is very thick. And when water starts boiling, it's very rhythmic. It starts going, bubble, 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 bubble in a very rhythmic pattern because it's thinner. But when you boil oil, it's thick. So it's kind of like bloom, 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 bloom. And that's essentially the difference between our normal voice and our vocal fry voice, is that the vocal folds are thicker and heavier because of the way they're held together. And so they tend to have this more irregular flapping, which comes across as this kind of grainy, crackly sound. And it's simply the sound of the vocal folds pushing air through in that way. This is actually something that we find in lots of languages as part of that language. So you might have a creaky way of saying a sound and a non-creaky way of saying a sound using the vocal folds in that way. And it actually makes a meaning difference in that language. English is not one of those languages. So then we can use differences for social stylistic purposes. And that seems to be what vocal fry does in English. If we look back at the history of vocal fry and the first mentions we can find in the research in linguistics about it, we have to go all the way back to the mid 20th century in Britain, where we find it commented on as a feature of men's speech.
Interesting.
In fact, the study done in the 70s in Britain found it to be 6 times more likely in men's speech than women's, and mainly in upper class men's speech to give off sort of a bored affectation. So it was kind of snobby boredom. That was the way it was giving off, but sort of like I'm pretty uppity and I'm pretty smart and I'm going to, not be that interested or not be that dedicated into listening to what you're doing. And it's still actually in studies today more prevalent in men's speech in Britain than women's. But what we never see in Britain is comments about vocal fry in men's speech being a vocal epidemic that's going to destroy their careers. In the United States, where all of a sudden it's associated with women, and it is true that young women in the United States use it more than young men do, even though young men also use it some. We see it described as the vocal tick of doom. So clearly there's a social value that's put on men's speech that's not put on women's speech that makes it okay for men, but not for women. And part of that is because there's a history of women's voices being stereotypically treated as negative. If you look at women in broadcasting or just women in workplaces, higher pitched voices tend to not be looked on as favorably. They're not considered as competent, as intelligent, or as reliable as deeper voices. And we find this true of men's voices as well. So higher pitched men's voices are less valued than lower pitched men's voices, but it's particularly hard for women because women have typically a higher pitched voice just naturally. So what we looked at is some research in the 1990s and in the early 2000s that compared male broadcasting speech to female broadcasting speech. And what they found is women broadcasters in the 1990s had started to use vocal fry when men didn't, probably to try to give off a lower pitch sense to their voice, because vocal fry is a lower pitch affectation. So when your vocal folds are vibrating slower, they give off a lower pitch. And then when we look in the 2000, there was a similar study done where they compared the use of vocal fry in broadcast speech and then the use of vocal fry in non-broadcast speech. And what they found were women broadcasters used vocal fry at a higher rate than male broadcasters, but in everyday speech, they didn't at all.
Oh, interesting.
Which suggests that women have a pressure to lower their voice in professional contexts, and that maybe this prevalence of vocal fry in broadcast speech makes us feel like women are using vocal fry all the time, which then might have served as a role model to young women looking for career or professionalization who adopted this feature in their speech to give off that more professional, urban kind of edge, which seems to be how young people take vocal fry. It's a more urban feature than a rural feature.
Are there any kind of vocal tics or linguistic things going on that actually drive you crazy? Because you're so positive. You're like, you like it all because you can learn about it. But is it the things come around every so often you're like, oh God, I can't wait till that one goes away, or I hope that doesn't stick around.
I'm just human, right? So I think the difference is I know a lot, so it makes me know what I'm allowed to react to. But I will say my own personal pet peeve is the ly on adverbs. I really like ly, and I'm sad to see it go because if you say he went slow to the park, that does grate on me, and because it traditionally was he went slowly. But I know it's a me problem, and actually the ly is dying. So in 50 years, there will not be ly on adverbs in those contexts. So if you look at even things in written speech, a lot of times you'll say he went, they went quick to the store, or he walked slow and I tried to keep up with him, when it should be slowly traditionally. But that's really, really a dying thing. And I will say that is my pet peeve. But I also realize that this is just the evolution of language, and it's my problem, and I need to get over it.
Well, if Stephen King had his way, there would be no adverbs at all, because I know he's very anti-adverb. I don't know in speaking. He's certainly anti-adverb in writing. Like he went in his book on writing, he goes on about how he doesn't think adverbs are necessary.
A lot, I think that's also true. I've seen a lot of legal advice on how to write things that are particularly antagonistic to adverbial intensifiers, because they think it detracts from, what you're trying to say, what you're actually saying. And that's sort of a weird way to look at language, because language is about expressing our thoughts. And if our thoughts want to express some sort of intensity, then I don't think it's inaccurate. But certainly in written language, there, I think, are a number of people that don't believe in adverbs.
Lolly, 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 get your adverbs here. Now that's a dated reference. I don't know if you remember that from Schoolhouse Rock. But anyway, okay, last thing, you're a writer. What advice did you get early on about writing? And especially now that you're writing, like this book is written for many audiences, but it's also written for, it's not just written for academics, this book, right? I mean, this is a book that is written for general audiences, but
right. It's typically not for academics. It's more for just general audiences.
And you've had to write in both different styles, but what have you learned about writing over the years that you could sort of pass on to other writers, maybe even academics who want to get into writing for more general audiences?
I've been asked that a lot by academics, because it really is hard to make that transition. There are a lot of people that have a really hard time translating what they know to everyday speech. And I would say that my agent was actually the most helpful in that regard, because I was always a writer that liked a lot of humor in my work. And so even I think as an academic writer, I was unusual in being a little less formal in my writing. And I think that's what attracted the great courses to me, is they heard me give an academic talk. And I used to always try to incorporate humor. And so when they approached me after a talk, I thought, sure, I'll give this a whirl. But my agent actually gave me really, really good advice that I think anybody can use. And she said, show, don't tell. She says, you tell me a lot, but I need you to show me. And what I took that to mean is, what's the image in my head that I'm trying to get to the image in your head? And if I can paint a picture rather than just use words to describe something, that's going to really help you understand what I'm talking about. So the ways to do that, for me at least, were use a lot of examples, right? Don't expect that what I'm thinking about is going to translate to what you might think about when I say things in a certain way. So if I'm using words to describe something, but I'm not providing you examples of what I mean by that, then I can't control what you're thinking, right? And you may not think the same thing I'm thinking. And it also doesn't help you illustrate what you're talking about. So I've used a lot of examples. I also use anecdotes that are super relatable. What in my experience gives life to what I'm trying to describe here. And then I also think what else is important is to not always start at the start, sometimes start in the middle. And, I know that's really the antithesis of what we've been taught in school. A lot of times when, you start your 5-paragraph essay and you start with your introduction, your thesis sentence. Well, a lot of times when I write, I don't have a thesis sentence. I have an idea and I write to my idea and the thesis sentence comes along, or the beginning comes later. And I write my academic work that way. And so, when I am starting an academic paper, I never start with my introduction. I always start with what's the meat of what I'm trying to say here. And I think that actually we undervalue that, where you're getting your thoughts out first and you're going to shape them later, but get the thoughts out and try to understand what you're going to try to get across. What's your main point? Because if you don't really understand it, you're not going to be able to translate that to anybody else. And you rarely honestly know what you're going to end up saying until you say it. So don't worry about having that perfect structure. Start somewhere that's most comfortable to you and go with that.
That's a great idea. Don't always write linearly. And I think people get stuck on intros. Intros are hard, like a really good intro.
They are hard.
Especially, in journalism, leads are really hard. And I sometimes get stuck on that where I'm like, how do I lead this story? And I'm like, no, just tell the story. You'll find the lead later. Maybe.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly it.
No, that's really good advice. It also strikes me that, what you're saying about show, don't tell, that is really a very big difference between writing and speaking, is that you could say, my God, that guy acted like he was 4, or something like that. But if you wrote, he acted like he was 4, it would be, again, that would be like telling rather than showing, well, how did he act like he was 4? Did he throw, it's a different thing. It's like there is by using that in that way, it speaks volumes, let's say, but it doesn't work when you're writing. Somehow. When
you're also in a context that both of you have access to, right? I mean, that when we're having a conversation, you and I are in the same space and we see what's going on. And you've seen his actions. I'm putting words to it. But on a page, you can't do that. I need to help you both see my actions and understand the words I put to it. So I think what we tend to forget is that we don't have that shared context in writing.
Well, Valerie Fridland, the book is called Literally Dude, Arguing for the Good in Bad English. It is such a fascinating read. We only scratched the surface here. So I so appreciate you coming on. And I'm very excited about your next book. You are 100% please come and talk about the accents book, because that's something that has always fascinated me. So
absolutely. I will definitely put you on my calendar for that.
Thank you for coming on the show. And best of luck with the book and with everything else.
Thank you so much. It was delightful.
Well, hey, everybody. Thanks for listening. Wasn't that fun? All right. You're probably wondering, why is it John's voice? We're so used to hearing John's daughter's voice at the end of these podcasts. Well, she was literally so busy that she couldn't help me record this promo. So I'm just going to have to do it myself. All right. I want to tell you about something I'm super excited about, and that is a class that I will be teaching on June 27th, 2024. It is called The Secret Formula to Writing Nonfiction Stories That Sell. And I'll be teaching this class remotely, so anybody in the world can take this course. And it is a 3-hour course, a 3-hour master class on everything that I have learned about writing stories that sell. You can ask people that have taken it in the past. It is basically a brain dump of my greatest hits. So I'm super excited to share this class with you, and I look forward to seeing you there. I will leave a link to how to sign up in the description of this podcast, and I hope to see you on June 27th. All right, until next week, this is John Small, encouraging you all to
do the right thing. Thing.